After a letdown season, you should expect Lane Kiffin to crush it in the transfer portal again for Ole Miss.
You are Locked On College Football with Spencer McLaughlin, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your daily source to stay up to date with this, the greatest sport on planet Earth. This episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. New customers, you can get a big return. If you place a $5 bet, you'll get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Scott Frost to UCF. I have many thoughts on that particular move in the Big 12 and quarterbacks on the move coming to a school near you. But let's start with Stephen Willis, Locked On Ole Miss. So that was, let's call it how we see it, shall we, Stephen? That was a flop of a season for Ole Miss. Yeah. Big expectations. I would have said before the year, 11-1 was more likely than 9-3. But the Kentucky, the Florida losses, huge, major letdown. The LSU game, LSU's pretty good, not great, but pretty good. But the Florida, the Kentucky games. That's a flop of a season for Lane Kiffin. But should college football fans expect him to crush it in the transfer portal anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the players that went into the portal today, like every wide receiver that went into the portal has Ole Miss nearly as a finalist. Like Eric Singleton's on there. The kid from Tulsa that was the American Athletic Conference Freshman of the Year guy that just one after another. There's rumors that Jaheim Otis and Ole Miss are heavily involved. Caleb Odom and Ole Miss are heavily involved. There are a lot of stars for Lane Kiffin to retool this team in last year's image, because this season, if we're going to be real about it, it was playoffs or bust. It was a bust.
Yeah, and he's been on Twitter actively, and we're going to get to that and all the lobbying and such, but how do you think that messaging lands when Ole Miss had these big expectations and again came up short? And I think this year, even more than the year prior, was a letdown for the Rebels, given the 12-team playoff and not being able to manage a 10-2 record with a mostly favorable schedule in that spot. Do you think that impacts the caliber of players they're able to get? Because everybody remember, this was the number one transfer portal class in the country in the last cycle. It was not Colorado. They were certainly up there, but Ole Miss had the highest rated transfer portal class. They had a great roster. They had an experienced quarterback with Jackson Dart. How does he go back to players in the transfer portal and say, look, with you guys, we're going to be able to make it happen this time?
Hey, if Ole Miss wins their Gator Bowl, which Ole Miss players are opting into that Gator Bowl. Jackson Dart's going to play. Jordan Watkins is going to play. Trey Washington's going to play. Trey Amos, even though he has a first-round PFF grade, is going to play in that game. And if Ole Miss wins that game, that is 3 out of the last 4 years that Ole Miss has won 10 games. Ole Miss hadn't won 10 games before those 3 years, and 3 out of the last 4 years. I don't think it's going to affect the caliber of player they can recruit this year, because everybody is looking at this year as, okay, they kind of made a mistake. They messed up against Kentucky. There was a little bit of an operational error going in there, and they just kind of weren't ready for SEC play, and it bit them. If Ole Miss can fix that and get to this level that they haven't been in, but now they're getting used to being in, they're going to keep knocking on that door until they kick it down.
With the Florida job remaining surely closed for one more season, do you think Ole Miss fans will have to endure any sort of coaching carousel talk for Lane Kiffin? Because I think if the Florida job's not open, I don't know that there's anywhere else in America where Lane Kiffin would be able to go.
You know, the Venn diagram of school places that Lane Kiffin is willing to go that can afford Lane Kiffin and has a job opening is not going to be very large. But Lane Kiffin is going to be mentioned for every single big-time job that comes open, because he is a name that generates clicks. He has a high Q rating, and SEO loves him. Search engine optimization. So every writer puts Lane Kiffin in every story, whether or not there's interest at all. Honestly, I do not think there was any interest in Florida this year, but Florida had massive interest in Lane. And of course, this is a two-side situation. One side really acted like they wanted him. One side was being completely quiet, so everybody kind of filled that vacuum with information. I don't think Lane was going anywhere, but that's not going to stop people from reporting it. That's not going to stop fan bases from wanting a coach that is potentially winning 10 games 3 out of the last 4 years.
I've been a Lane Kiffin fan for a while, Steven. I think he's a good coach. I don't know if he's as great as some people might make him out to be in their heads, but you look at his track record, he's a good coach. Like you say, he's doing something at Ole Miss that has not been done before, ever in the history of Mississippi football. I like that he is honest on Twitter. I like that he gets in front of a mic and mostly just says exactly what he thinks. He is mentally, for me, in a timeout because of what he has been doing over the last couple of weeks. I think he has gone way overboard. And look, because he has job security, I don't think it matters. But the amount of lobbying and the tone and tenor of the tweets he's been sending out, I think it comes off as whiny at this point when you have losses to Florida and Kentucky.
Wait a minute. Lane's doing just what he has to do because there's somebody sitting directly behind him in the poll that was being absolutely insufferable that he won by 27 points or 24 points against in South Carolina, saying they deserve to be in the playoffs.
Which I was against, by the way. Yeah. I came right on the show and said, no, that's not a playoff team.
But Lane Kiffin cannot just sit there and let them talk and let Alabama talk and all these other people that Lane Kiffin genuinely has an argument to be in front of. I'm not saying that Ole Miss deserved to be in the playoffs. I'm saying that Ole Miss deserved to be ahead of Alabama and South Carolina. And Lane Kiffin believes that as well. And whenever that argument comes into play, and then you have the Miami argument because they wanted to do stuff, whatever. Lane Kiffin just had an ACC team that won 3 or 4 or 5 games. It wasn't a good ACC team, but it was an ACC team that almost played on the field in their place and beat them so bad that they refused to play the game again. And Lane Kiffin, that was the thing. And if you look at the record against the ACC that Lane Kiffin has had, he's not just going to stand there and let people chirp at him because there's nothing to back it up. Now, I do agree that him lobbying and all the lobbying for the playoffs that happened was just insufferable, especially the South Carolina thing. That just gives me a headache thinking about it. But Lane Kiffin kind of sticking up for his team and lobbying for his team, that's the reason that Ole Miss is paying him $10 million.
I think there's a line that he went over between lobbying and just complaining. Like the lobbying was, hey, I feel like we're good enough for this. We deserve an opportunity. And if you want to have a resume comparison between Alabama and Ole Miss floated out there, I think that's fine. But he looked like he was just sitting around with nothing better to do other than get on Twitter and go work on, crafting an argument or a clever tweet or this, that, and the other thing. Just say, well, Ole Miss is this, and the other conferences, they're not even close. Like, you can't play a bottom tier team. You can't play a bottom tier team in the ACC, beat the crap out of them, and then say, oh, look, the ACC's terrible. The ACC's won a bunch of games against the SEC this year, and I bet they win more in bowl season.
But not against Ole Miss, which everybody
but he made a conference-wide comparison. He said, well, everybody else is not playing the same level of football as we are, and I thought that's where he went over the line.
That is fine. Everybody in the ACC, in order to get Miami into the playoff or Clemson into the playoff, was taking a shot at Ole Miss because of the Kentucky game. I can see why Lane Kiffin got defensive over that because he got brought into arguments that he really wasn't in. And he felt the need to defend Ole Miss's program. And when it got personal, ACC versus SEC and ACC versus Ole Miss, there's numbers that backed up Lane Kiffin's argument. And like I said, SMU deserves to be in the playoffs. They belong in the playoffs.
Fully agree.
Yeah, that was fun. I don't have a problem with that. But whenever you look at those 4 teams that at that point that was fighting to get in, because if we remember correctly, it was Alabama, Miami, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. Out of those 4 teams, Ole Miss has an argument. Absolutely. It doesn't matter if they lost to Kentucky. They beat Georgia, and they beat the heck out of South Carolina. But that wasn't the case in the end of the day. So it all kind of worked out, which I will say this. Even though the committee got this right, there doesn't need to be a committee anymore. They just need to do the BCS computers, let the 12 teams or whatever it is be what they are, get rid of automatic bids, and just take all of this drama out of the process because that's all it is right now.
Auto bids for buys are a disaster.
Yes, terrible.
If you want to have auto bids as the 5 highest ranked conference champions get into the playoff, that's fine. You know what? I truly am fine with that. You should not automatically get to have a bye. Why does Clemson have a bye when their resume, to me, is not as impressive even as Indiana, let alone Ohio State or Tennessee or even Penn State for that matter? Why do they get to be in that position? Why does Boise State get to be ahead of Arizona State? There's just so many problems. Many problems with this, Stephen.
Arizona State is going to be the team that I root for in this playoff. So whenever I say this,
they're an easy team to root for.
Yeah, don't ever anybody hear me talk bad mouth in Arizona State. Didn't Arizona State lose to a 5-7 team this year?
They lost to Cincinnati without their starting quarterback.
Yeah. And that happened, and they're sitting at 3 or 4, and they have the bye. Arizona State, honestly, should probably be the 10 seed, the 9 seed, somewhere in that ballpark. But because of these weird rules, now you have a situation where Texas is the 5 seed. They're going to open up hosting Clemson, which is the lowest seed in the tournament. Texas should beat Clemson because Clemson has not fared well against the SEC this year. And then you have Arizona State matching up, or it's Boise State, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, no. Boise is the 3. Arizona State is the 4. Yeah. It would be Texas against
it's just a
Arizona State.
Free pass to the semifinals. Oregon has a harder road to the semifinals than Texas does.
The number 1 overall seed of all the teams that have a bye absolutely has the toughest path to get to the semifinals and national championship writ large. Why? Because that's the system that we've just dumbfoundingly created. Stephen Willis, Locked On Ole Miss. Stephen, appreciate it as always.
Yeah, real quick, I do want to say this. Tennessee is better suited for cold weather than Ohio State, so the cold weather in Ohio State could benefit the Vols.
Oh, I am this close to picking the Vols to win that football game, in which case Ryan Day might be showing the door.